Okay, so in discussing the perceptual errors, and we can see that stereotypes might feed into that, but these are more clearly defined. So I want to talk about the halo effect, I want to talk about leniency, central tendency, primacy effect, recency effect, contrast effect. Let us go, and oh my god, how cute. This dog actually looks a lot like our dog, we lost Digby last year, but that looks an awful lot like Digby, and if it was possible for Digby to have a halo, I think he would, because he was just the kindest, nicest dog on the planet. He was just a happy dog, and he loved the cats, and the cats loved him. Everything about Digby was happy. Unless there were strangers around, then he could get his back up. But the halo effect simply means what is beautiful is good. And the idea is that when we look at someone and they're beautiful, there is this natural tendency to believe that their beauty extends to areas of performance as well, right? So a rater forms an overall impression about an object and then uses that impression to bias ratings about the object. What we found, what research has found, and it's a shame, but attractive people get better assignments, they get more promotions, they make more money because of this. What is beautiful is good, right? Now, the downside is to this, if you're beautiful and you get opportunities given to you, then you have to wonder, am I being rewarded on the basis of my beauty or on the basis of my skill, my performance, etc.? So it's a double-edged sword. But all else being equal, if someone is attractive, and I had some students do this in 520, which is now 4520, social psych research methods advanced level course. It was a portion of their experiment, and what they did is they found two pictures, a picture of two different women. One was clearly rated a 10, 9.5, 10, very attractive. The other was rated a 3, not as attractive, let's put it that way. They put their pictures kind of on the top of a sheet of paper, and it was identical sheets of paper. And then they said, please rate this person in attractiveness. And they had a scale of 1 to 10. So their participant could rate that person in terms of attractiveness. But then the rating scale assessed 15 more items below attractiveness. One was punctuality, intelligence, right? Reliability, etc., creativity. Things that are not associated with attractiveness at all. But what happened is, the 10 got higher ratings on average across all those unrelated qualities than the 3 did. So this is the example of the halo effect. That is, one's physical beauty then bleeds over to assessments of their other qualities. Now note, when we talked about previously evaluating people on objective criteria, you can begin to see why I stress that so much and why I feel it's so frickin' important. Because these biases can affect our perception and therefore our ratings of those people who work with us, work for us, right? So the idea is we have to eliminate this bias. One of the easiest ways to do it is by starting to use objective rather than subjective measures. Subjective measures are easily contaminated. That's something we said in that lecture. And it's by these systems of biases that they are often contaminated. So there's no substitute for objective performance measures. Now the leniency effect. And this is kind of it can be stereotype invoked, but it can also be kind of just an individual difference. Some of us are more lenient and some of us are more harsh. Some of us are more forgiving, some of us are more demanding, right? So it's a personal characteristic that leads an individual to consistently evaluate other people as objects in extremely positive fashion. But notice that it could also be then modified or moderated by a stereotype. That is, I treat this group of people more leniently and this group of people less leniently. And we see this in especially police work, that police are often alleged to treat white people they encounter differently than black people that they encounter. And we say, well, we have to do bias training, right? And we have to put an end to this. Now, whether the training works or not, I mean, it can be empirically demonstrated. A lot of controversy about these types of training and how to measure the results. But note, I'm going to ask you should I tip my hat on the homework? We're going to be making a training video. That's what I'm going to ask you to do, right? So, and it's going to be about one of these qualities. Now, central tendency. This is a tendency to avoid all extreme judgments. So if I'm a supervisor and I'm rating my employees, man, I don't like to use, if it's a 7-point scale, I don't like to give people 1s or 7s. In fact, I'm not even really comfortable with 2s and 6s. I like to confine my ratings kind of towards the center of the scale, right? And the downside is maybe I'm being more fair to people, but I'm not doing a good job of differentiating people on the basis of this. So average or neutral. On questionnaires, the tendency to avoid the more extreme responses and kind of go just down the middle. Okay. Another bias that some of us may possess, others may not, right? So it's kind of individually difference-oriented. Now, the primacy effect. This is the tendency for initial impressions to stick. First impressions matter for better or for worse. So, when we're told about the importance of first impressions, you make a poor first impression. It's not necessarily the end of the world, especially depending on who formed that impression about you. But it does present at least a little extra work to overcome a poor first impression. A good first impression can go a long way to having the person perceive you more favorably in the future. So you can see that the primacy effect, if there's a good first impression, might then kind of feed to the halo effect. In the laboratory and theoretically, we separate these effects for the sake of writing research articles and studying them empirically. But there may be some overlap in the real world, so realize that. Now, these thin slice judgments, as Nalini Ambati described them in her research, they can be made in just seconds. And Nalini Ambati says that they can be quite accurate. But they can also be misled, especially when stereotypes are involved as part of the mechanism of making these first impressions. So initial impressions may form a yardstick by which future behavior is judged. Violations of expectations can be dangerous. So if you're hired because you're thought to be absolutely outstanding in this area, or let's say in preparing your resume, that you kind of fibbed a little bit and you kind of overstated your ability, this creates a first impression that's a yardstick, and it says, well, it said, you know, in your resume that you have expertise in this, but I'm not seeing your first performance as being indicative of expertise. You might be, in fact, judged more harshly. So leave it to that, and there's been plenty of sitcoms, situational comedies where people have been taught, don't lie on your resume because it might come back to bite you. And you really shouldn't, right? Now, the flip side of the primacy effect is the recency effect. And notice this could also be tied to an extremity bias, if you will. That is, what's extreme? Well, the first thing that I noticed about the person and the last thing I noticed carry extra weight. So the primacy is what I noticed first. Recency is based on perhaps my last experience, right? So it's a tendency to remember recent information. If the information is negative, the person then may be evaluated more negatively, right? So what do we know? Well, if you want to capitalize on the recency effect and you know that you're having a performance evaluation every 6 months, when should you do your absolute best work? Or make an awesome suggestion? Yeah, a week or two before your performance evaluation, because it'll be stuck in your evaluator's mind. It's more likely to color their overall perception of you. Now, knowing that as a boss allows you to perhaps be less biased in your evaluations of a person, less influenced. But knowing as an employee might actually give you a leg up. So, double bonus there for you guys, if you will. Now, contrast effects is the tendency to evaluate people or objects by comparing them with characteristics of recently observed people or objects. And so, if your team of people you're working with is somewhat mediocre in their performance, kind of average, they miss deadlines at times, their performance is average at best, if you outperform them, then you may get the benefit. Your performance might be here compared to them, but based on the contrast effect, the distance is magnified, and you look all the more superior. Now notice it can work the other way as well. And I'm a big fan of the contrast effect. I've done some research in people's punishment preferences. That was kind of one of my research areas in kind of a legal context, jury decision making. And contrast effects are potent. They can be quite powerful. If a juror looks like to be a total reactionary asshole, right, and says, we got to find this guy guilty no matter what, and they come off as a real hard ass, everyone else is kind of like, man, I'm more moderate than that, and they often kind of contrast away and become more lenient in their evaluation based on that single harsh juror. Contrast effect is relatively robust, but again, what can we do? How can we capitalize on it? Well, if you want to surround yourself by mediocrity and you work hard, then you might stand out to a greater extent, but I don't think that's a good tactic. It's not good for the company. Right? Now, attribution errors. Linus is asking Lucy, why are you so anxious to criticize me? And, well, I just think I have a knack for seeing other people's faults. And then Linus responds, what about your own faults? And she says, I have a great knack for overlooking those. And so this is a good example of the actor-observer effect. But let's talk about these three as we move through. The fundamental attribution error is we rely on dispositional explanations for a person's behavior. So when we want to explain an outcome in the workplace, we tend to explain that outcome on the basis of who we believe them to be, some aspect, some trait, some characteristic of the person. Right? It's easier to blame characteristics, and it's typically automatic. Additional effort is necessary to go beyond saying, oh, they blew it because they're a moron, right? And notice what Deming would say about this. We often blame employees. Oh my God, if they were more competent, this wouldn't have happened. But what Deming is going to say is, look, this happened 85% of the time. This happens, it's because of the system. It's not because of the person. So Deming is one of the chief proponents of escaping or moving away from the fundamental attribution error. Don't blame the worker for this because they're incompetent or they were sleepy or they're, look at the systemic explanation, the situational explanation. So we have a choice. We can blame it on the disposition. We can blame it on the situation. We're usually better off going to the situation, but it does take more cognitive effort. Right? Yeah. The actor-observer effect, Linus and Lucy kind of spelled that out for us. It's a bit of a spin, and the way we work on the spin of the fundamental attribution error is for bad outcomes. If I generate a bad outcome, what I want to do is provide an excuse. An excuse is a situational explanation, right? I don't say to my boss, wow, that happened because I suck. I say that happened because the customer was on drugs or whatever excuse we can make up. So when something bad happens, I want to spin it as a situational explanation. But if something good happens, I want to say, hey, am I bitching or what, right? And I want to make it dispositional. But we flip it around for the actor-observer effect. When we're talking about someone else, we do the opposite, just as Lucy described. So and vice versa. If they do well, and especially if they're my competitor for a promotion, I say, oh shit, didn't they get lucky? That is, I invoke a situational explanation for their success, right? And not a dispositional. So we are very flexible cognitively. And note, I said if we're seeking a promotion, that's a goal, then it affects the way we perceive the situation and the way we remember the situation and the way we act on the situation. So it takes us back to that wheel at the beginning of this lesson. Now the ultimate attribution error is we take the actor-observer effect as just described, and now we apply it to the in-group versus the out-group. So we might say, oh, those union members, those guys, right? And then we give a dispositional explanation. Those union members suck because they don't care about the company. We talk dispositionally about them when something bad happens, or we'll talk situationally when something good happens. So if you ultimate attribution error, just take everything you know about the actor-observer effect, and instead of saying person, say group. And that's that. So how many of you are up on the self-fulfilling prophecy? Most of us are pretty well versed on the self-fulfilling prophecy. There's just a slight spin on it when we put it into an organizational context. Right? In this case, let's start with the supervisor expectancy. And the supervisor has an expectation about how people are going to behave, and this then affects how they employ their leadership style, right, or manage the situation, if you will. This then affects the subordinates' sense of their ability to do it. If I have great confidence, then I say, you know, I'm confident in the person, that's my expectation, and then I lead kind of hands off. I say, yeah, you go for it. I trust your judgment on this. Do what you need to do, right? And then the subordinate feels confident, their self-expectancy goes up, and it builds their self-efficacy. Whereas if my expectancy is that this person is a screw-up, right, and I micromanage them, then the person believes that they can't do it without this micromanagement, right? This affects the person's motivation, the worker's motivation, right, which then can have an impact on their performance. Now, number 4, there's a very simple line, and if you want to take psychomotivation next semester, we look at this in great detail, and I assure you it's not as simple as that little line, but for our sake and our purpose within this lesson, let's go with it. And then the performance feeds to the supervisor's expectancy, and we know in the self-fulfilling prophecy at this point it's supposed to confirm the supervisor's expectancy. But now notice, this is where the model gets a little different within an organizational context, that we explain that the performance then also affects the subordinate's self-expectancy, their belief that can they do it or not. So successes, if this is all good, I think they can do it, and I lead them in such a way, and then they believe they can do it, and they're highly motivated to do it, so they do it well, then they believe that they have greater expectations for themselves in the future, and also increase the supervisor's expectancies. So how you go into a situation and how you give instructions to someone, and the nature of the pep talk, if you will, that you give them moving into this is all important, right? So when Cravens-Brown announced in our lecturers meeting, she says, well, all of us have our course assurances forms done, and the university now requires us, since we're online, these nasty course assurance forms that we have to fill out for each class. Said, everyone's done. Well, except Mark, he's got 3 to do for spring semester because he teaches all these different courses. But what Cravens-Brown says, he's already filled out 4 of these. He knows what he's doing. It's not an issue, right? And I'm sure that we're all willing to help him with this if he gets in a pinch and we need to do this, right? So I'm fine with it, right? There's an expectation that I will get it done. I've done it in the past. It's all good, right? But Cravens-Brown is a very good supervisor. She demonstrates tremendous leadership qualities, and she set it up in such a way that it increases my motivation to get it done, and I'll do a better job as a result of this. Right? So I know they're due next Friday, which was kind of a short deadline, but I'm good with it, and I'll have it done. And she knows, and I actually emailed her yesterday and assured her that they'll be done on time, no issue. And she emailed me back, and she says, look, whatever I can do to help, just let me know, and I will be there for you. So it's really the kind of, this organizational model, self-fulfilling prophecy, is very positively oriented within our lecturers group in psychology. And that's what makes it such a bitchin' organization to work for. And I want you to consider then, if you put yourself in that blue box, if you're the supervisor, what will you be doing to cause a positive result out of this cycle rather than a negative result? And that shit's on you. So, you know, if you guys are going to step up and you're going to lead well, which I am confident that you will, and that's why I do this at all, is to help give you the tools to do that. Better things happen for all of us. Right? Now, let's talk a little bit about motivated attributions. To me, this is one of the most centrally important aspects of social cognition, if you will, that when we explain behavior, and explaining behavior is making an attribution. When we ask the question, why did they do that? Or why did they do that way, right? What we're trying to do is attribute their behavior to a given cause. We're trying to identify the cause. So, what are we talking about here? Well, the desired attributional outcome affects the attribution made. So if this person is one of our peeps, this is one of our rising stars, this is one of the people that we like and we want and we want to continue to like, and that's the motivated part. I want to continue to see this person favorably. I want to continue to like this person. Then if they make a mistake, we'll explain it situationally. Because when the situation changes, then they won't make that mistake. But if I want this person out of there, if I want to fire their ass, if I'm done with them, if I want them to transfer to a different department and they make a mistake, then I'm going to use that dispositional explanation in service of getting rid of them. They suck. Why are they even here? So we're very flexible again in the way we think and the way we explain behavior. So my motivation, and we go back to that wheel, then my motivation is at the root of my explanation for their behavior. Now, this could be chronic or stereotype motivated, but it also could be individual and based on individual relationships. So it can be based on temporary states as well. What we found is if we look at the self literature, and for those of you who've taken the self course, right, in our social psychology department, people are motivated to maintain their self-esteem by and large, on average. So this motivated attribution extends to themselves. And they'll view the world in terms of supporting their self-esteem and protecting their self-esteem. So again, when they're looking at causes of their own behavior, it can be in the service of self-esteem maintenance or self-esteem enhancement. Right? So this to me, Ziva Kunda brought up this idea of motivated reasoning back in the 90s and wrote a tremendous paper that inspired all kinds of researchers to demonstrate in the laboratory how it works. Pete Ditto is one of those people, and I was so fortunate when I got to University of California, Irvine, that I immediately had a class with Ditto. He needed research assistance, and I latched onto him, and that created a very useful relationship for both of us, me working in his lab, but me also being trained in motivated reasoning. And that's one of the reasons I am at Ohio State Graduate School, because my advisor, Phil Tetlock at Ohio State, was a huge fan of Dittos. So my being a Ditto student, he thought that would bring that component of motivated reasoning into his laboratory, which is a perspective he wanted in where he was taking his research. And that's how that shit kind of works out. So let us then break for our final part, I believe. So we'll look at part 3 here coming up.